Everybody for coming. My name's Alexis Harrison. I'm co-president of Fair Plan, one of the groups that is sponsoring this event tonight. Just for those who are not familiar with Fair Plan, we're an organization that has a long history here in Fairfield. We're dedicated to supporting open spaces, neighborhoods, natural resources, and doing it through good government, good regulations, and just good plain work. So that's a little background on us. Our co-sponsor is the League of Women Voters of Fairfield, and I'd like to bring up Margaret Mary Fitzgerald, an old friend, and she'll give you a little information about her group.
Thank you, Good evening. I can't tell you how happy and delighted that the League of Women Voters of Fairfield is to have been invited to partner with Fair Plan to present this evening's program. The League has had environmental issues on its radar screen since the early 1960s, and we continue to have environmental issues on our forefront. We're also delighted to have a panel of journalists because the League is also interested in having factual data and information presented in media, whether it's print media or radio or television and the like. So we're going to be interested tonight to hear from these folks. I just want to plug a few things about the League of Women Voters. I don't know what you're doing on this coming Sunday, but if you are interested in hearing a free presentation on executive privilege, its history, going back to George Washington, executive privilege, its use and abuse throughout the course of our history, please come to the Fairfield Museum and History Center at 2:30. Doors open at 2 for light beverages and food, but we're going to be doing that. I also encourage you to be on the lookout for the League's Voters Guide, which will be coming out closer to the election. We have that online. And also be paying attention to our upcoming candidates nights, where we will be hosting debates for those individuals running for the Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, and Board of Education. And lastly, September 24th is the National Voters Registration Day, and the League of Women Voters of Fairfield is partnering with both libraries, the main library downtown and also Fairfield Woods Middle School, and we will be registering new voters. So if you have grandchildren, nieces, nephews, new neighbors who've moved in who need to register to vote in Fairfield so that their vote can be counted in November, please stop by so that we can, it's quick, please stop by so that we can register those folks. Alexis, thank you so very much.
Great, thank you. So as Margaret Mary mentioned, together we wanted to bring a panel and really teach the community about something a little different. And as we know, the environmental beat is no easy task, especially these days. And it can be hard. Certainly, it's covering different regulations, a lot of rollbacks. It's going to remote places. The Amazon is literally up in flames. It's a really important beat, and we're really glad to have these 4 people here. I want to give a quick history on environmental reporting. Maybe you guys you'll teach us about this too. But it actually dates back to the 60s, obviously, when Rachel Carson wrote her book, Silent Spring, in 1962, and different political groups were coming into actions to advocate for the environment. And it was further legitimized by the Wilderness Act, which was passed in 1964. So the mass media has really followed that, and it's obviously a very important issue to all of us. Before we start tonight, I want to call out Joy Shaw, who has spoken for the environment in Fairfield for many, many years, since the 60s, maybe even before that. But you've been, a leader and an advocate, and have taught us so much. So I just wanted to raise our not glasses to you. So with that said, I will introduce our great panel. At the end, we have Kat Bagley, who is managing editor of the Yale Environment 360. She was previously a reporter for Inside Climate News and is co-author of the book Bloomberg's Hidden Legacy: Climate Change in the Future of New York City. Next to her, we have Greg Latke from the Hartford Courant. He's the environmental reporter at that newspaper, which is the country's oldest newspaper. Prior to that, he was the state capitol bureau chief for the New Haven Register, and he's written for various publications, including the New York Times, the Connecticut Magazine, and the Boston Globe. Next is our friend Timothy Brown, who came here from New Haven. Timothy is editor of Connecticut Woodlands Magazine, which is a quarterly magazine published by the Connecticut Forest and Park Association. His day job, he's also manager of National Geographic on campus, the Society's University Outreach Initiative. Lastly, but not least, we have Rachel Scharf, Fairfield's own. She covers everything at the Fairfield Citizen, and most recently has really delved deep into a lot of environmental issues the town has faced. So we welcome her as well. So we will start from left to right, if that's okay. And perhaps you can tell us, Kat, how you started getting involved with the environment and covering these issues.
Sure. So I think it all started, I was in college and I was an environmental science major and was thinking very hard about going to get my PhD, doing ecological research. I spent my undergrad basically traipsing all over the Adirondack Mountains, and I loved it until I realized that, number one, the idea of focusing on a single scientific topic for my entire life was really terrifying. And then the other was there was so much amazing research going on, and so many scientists didn't know how to tell their stories or communicate the work that they were doing. And so I was really interested in that intersection of environmental science and specifically climate change at that point, which was just sort of emerging into the public discussion. And combining that with journalism. I went to Columbia and got a dual master's, a master's in Earth and Environmental Sciences and a master's from the journalism school there, and just started freelancing, working for publications like Popular Science and Audubon Magazine, and have felt very lucky to still be doing it 12 years later, at a time when the media, journalism industry has gone through a lot of upheaval. And at a time when environmental journalism has gone from the first jobs to be cut when a newsroom was shrinking to now suddenly, this renewed interest and this realization that this is an issue that people need to talk about. I mean, just one example of sort of the 180-degree shift is Yale Environment 360 is joining more than 200 news organizations next week, dedicating its all of its media coverage to climate change. And so that just gives you an idea of how big of an issue this has now become and the interest.
I came to environmental reporting a little late in my career. I spent more than 20 years covering state government and the state capitol. And I got very tired of all the talk and so little action that came out of that place. And the screw-ups in state government got very repetitive. And when I came to the Hartford Courant, they asked me what I wanted to cover. And environment was one of those things. Along with that, I cover agriculture, which is part of it. I cover food issues. And unfortunately, I have to cover the politics that goes along with all those. But I've become convinced, and it's pretty easily provable, that climate change is the issue of our time. And it affects virtually everything, and the interconnections between all this stuff is constantly fascinating.
First of all, I wanted to say thanks so much for coming out tonight and for being here to talk about this important issue. I also came to environmental writing somewhat later in my career. I was trained as a wildlife biologist and worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service out in Washington State on Canada lynx, and then became interested in moving from the field to the classroom and became a high school environmental science teacher for 8 years. and actually encountered some resistance with parents for teaching climate change. Parents that felt like I was politicizing my classroom by teaching climate change. So I got interested in how we actually talk about the environment and the values and belief systems that go into our environmental values. And so I went back to school and did a master's degree where I studied climate skeptics, or what people commonly refer to as climate deniers, and did ethnography in the US with climate deniers. And at the same time, got very interested in journalism and was working for a small student publication at my school. And from there transitioned into working at the Connecticut Forest and Park Association, now as their editor of their quarterly magazine. And I've brought a limited number of the magazines, and you're welcome to take one after the panel tonight. But this is a magazine that's been around since the 1930s. The organization itself will celebrate its 125th anniversary next year. And what we try to do with the magazine is take global issues and bring them down to a local scale so that we're really understanding impacts here in the state of Connecticut.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I feel like I'm deeply the least qualified person here, but I guess I can bring a bit of a local perspective. So I report on the Fairfield Citizen right here. I've only been doing that for about 3 months. I graduated from college just in June, where I majored in English and was really, really involved in journalism, and have known since pretty early on in college that I wanted to pursue journalism. And the environment has always been something that I was really interested in, and it was always just really a part of my life. I've always loved hiking. I went to school in the Berkshires. I spent part of high school in Vermont, and I've always been really, really concerned with climate change, and always been, it's always been something that's been on my mind. And sort of fortuitously, although not fortuitously at all, Fairfield has been in what some are saying is an environmental, really difficult situation here in town. And so in my first few months here, I've ended up covering the environmental beat with what many people are now calling, the Phil Pyle issue. Many people probably know what I'm talking about. In town here in Fairfield, there's been some issues with potential contamination of our parks and fields, and so I've ended up covering that pretty extensively over my first few months here. And so I've just sort of been really doing the environment here in Fairfield. And so that's what I'm excited to keep doing and learn more about.
Great. You've been doing a great job.
Thank you.
We'll move on, and Greg, we'll put you on the spot next. How do you translate the technical aspects of environmental reporting into something discernible that everybody can read and understand?
I think it's probably one of the most difficult things about the job. So much of the information that's coming out is coming from scientists, and as Kat was saying, they don't often know how to translate that into understandable English, or Spanish for that matter. So the biggest task is to find ways to make it understandable, and to not overwhelm people with numbers. They say all politics is local, and everything about the environment is local too. And so the best way, I think, to make it understandable to people is to bring it down to even to an individual level or to a community level. It gets the message across much easier that way and much more quickly.
Same question for you.
Yeah, no, this is an excellent question, and certainly if you talk about climate change, this is a really important issue because people can get kind of lost in some of the nuances of the complexities of the science and so forth. But I think it's also true with pretty much any environmental issue that we have, where, like Kat and Greg are saying, the science can be so complex that you need to have an advanced degree in a specific field to understand maybe the statistics or something. So what we try to do at Connecticut Woodlands is what we call human-centered narrative storytelling. So if it's a scientist, if it's a landowner, if it's a citizen, we put them as the character, the main focal point in the story, and allow the science or the environmental issues to sort of emerge from an exploration of this particular character. And we try to do it in a way, I always think about my mother as being sort of my target audience. You know, she's well educated, very literate. She reads, all the time, but she doesn't have a background in environmental studies, or in the environmental field generally. So I always think about, like, that's my audience that I want to be writing for, and I want my contributors to be writing for. Somebody that could pick up a magazine, you could see it on a coffee table, pick it up, read the article, and really understand what we're trying to say without having to have an advanced degree.
Yeah, same question for everybody, Rachel. I know you've been going through, various results from the health department. So how do you translate that?
Yeah, I think one of my favorite things about journalism in sort of every kind of thing you cover is the task of turning something in, like, that might be complicated or really high level into something that the average person can consume and understand on a human level. And that goes for environmental things, but I do a lot of, in my work, 'cause I also cover courts and cops and things like that, is taking things like affidavits or things like, court documents and making them into, a couple hundred words that a regular person can understand, which is really hard, but so rewarding, because you're taking something that's really important, but is not, meant for the average person to necessarily be able to understand, and to make it really accessible. And so, for instance, with looking like an environmental report, being able to go through that and to look through it and to really suss out the important details, because you might get, Alice, and this was the case with, if anyone here has looked at some of the reports that have come out from this testing that's gone on in town, these are pages and pages of numbers and long lists of chemicals, and getting the three the three really important things in that report and distilling it down to the what's really the important facts, so that a regular person and an average reader can read that in 5 minutes and understand it, is really rewarding, and I think the really important task of journalism.
Great.
I think, from my perspective, I think one of the biggest issues that often happens with environmental and science journalism in general is that reporters are not given enough time to write these stories. I mean, these are really complex issues, and I think often when you're dealing with daily reporting or online news sites where it's quick hits, it ends up that people are writing these stories, they don't quite understand the science, and maybe they're just sort of repeating what's in a press release. The best environmental journalism is when a reporter has time to thoroughly read the research, interview all the scientists involved, interview their colleagues not involved with the research to fully understand the significance of it and the impact that it could have, and to go through rigorous editing, all with this in mind, as Tim mentioned, who's going to be the target audience, how much do they know about this issue, and really taking the time to phrase and craft your story in such a way that it's going to really get understood by the right people, and by readers in general. And then I think the other thing that hasn't been mentioned is the power of data journalism and graphics in science storytelling. We're very luckily in an age now where scientists are starting to get really savvy with presenting their results in really innovative graphic ways, and then allowing those things to be published under Creative Commons licenses, which allows newspapers and publications to reuse them. And I think that can be some of the best ways that people can fully understand an environmental issue. A perfect example of this is the fires in the Amazon, right? I mean, you can say to your reader that there are currently, I think it's over 3,000 fires burning in the Amazon right now. But then you look at the satellite data and you see all of those red points scattered throughout the Amazon, and then you go, whoa. Like, now I understand just how extensive this problem is. So, yeah.
Good point.
Great. So we know sources are the lifeblood for every journalist. And Timothy, we'll start with you. Can you tell us how you assess the credibility of the sources that you talk with, whether it's past or present?
Yeah. So could be whichever organization they're with. If they're with DEEP, if they're with a particular research institution, university, like letting that sort of be sort of first tier, looking at their credibility within their own field, I think is super important. But at the same time, it becomes somewhat of a challenge because what we're trying to do is to tell a good story. And we're not a scientific journal. We're not, PNAS, or we're not, Science or Nature. And when you talk to a scientist, what they may think is really the key message is not necessarily from a narrative standpoint what we think is the key message for our readers. And so, so sometimes, we'll let some of our sources read certain quotes that we're going to publish, because we're not an investigative outlet. We're not trying to have a gotcha moment for some scientist out there. We're trying to really communicate to our readership. So we let our sources read their quotes. This is what we're going to put in. And say, well, no, we need this and this and this. Like, well, no, that actually, it kind of confuses the reader. It takes us off of a narrative track. So I think it is challenging. And I think that for readers, you have to be very careful that just because somebody has several letters behind their name or they come from a particular place, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have not been influenced by money or politics or saying something for less than scientific validity, those kinds of reasons. A simple case in point, a lot of research, state research universities receive money from major international corporations like Dow or Monsanto. And so if you talk to, for example, soil scientists at Iowa State, you need to follow the money trail and make sure that they're not receiving a lot of their research funding from Monsanto, which may then, influence the way that they respond to some sort of questioning.
And I would add, related to that, I think I've done a lot of climate change coverage and reporting, and there have been a lot of think tanks that are very deceptive with the names of what they name those think tanks. Yeah. And so you always, you're like, oh, this person sounds really great. They are seemingly publishing in reputable journals. And then you go and you realize, who are their major funders, mm-hmm. and what are they saying at conferences, or what are they saying in other op-eds. So, I will say this is a great age to be an environmental reporter, to have the entire archive of the internet readily available, to be able to thoroughly check, who your sources are.
For me, it's very often a case of finding out the right person to talk to, and then evaluating them over time. You develop sources that you trust, and some that you go, well, I'm not so sure about that person. So some of it's instinct, and some of it's just fact checking. As you're talking, you can't trust everybody, and as readers, you shouldn't trust just one publication. Actually, we get it wrong. Hopefully, not too often, but sometimes we get it wrong. And but most of the sources I think we deal with are legitimate scientists trying to do what they do best, they may disagree with the way we present the information, but most of the time, most of the people I talk with are very glad somebody's interested, because especially with climate change these days, they are so totally convinced of the importance of it and how it impacts so many different areas that I think they're glad that anybody's paying attention at all sometimes.
Yeah. Rachel, do you have anything to say on that?
No, I would agree with all of that. I think the only other thing is that I think also just multiple sources is also often the key. If you hear something from one source and you're not sure about it, and you're wrestling with whether or not to, if it needs more than what they said, get another source and see if it's corroborated. And I think that's often a really good tool that journalists use.
Great, thank you.
Can I just also I want to put a shout out for E360 too, because you're one of the few outlets that still hires and pays fact checkers. And I know because I was one at the time. It's actually really a catastrophe in the field that lots of outlets just can't afford to have fact checkers anymore, or don't have fact checkers. And so,
and I can vouch for that.
Yeah.
The number of the amount of time that we have to write a lot of these environmental stories is minimal, and the number of editors that see the story has been drastically reduced. So I agree with you completely. 360 is a key source. Yeah. Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Great plug. So we'll move along here. How do you discern well-funded, legitimate coverage versus social media and things that are out there and different blogs versus what's real? Like, how would you advise the reader on how to discern that?
Start with the youngest person.
It's hard, and I think credibility is a hard thing to judge, and I think, as more, we were just talking about this before we started, as more and more people get their news from social media, from things like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, it really is a scary time to be thinking about consumers of media, and I think what I tell people who are, looking at online media is just to, if you see something on Facebook, you click on who posted it and scroll down there and get a better sense of what the source is, and don't just believe everything you see and you read because it's words on a page. And I think just going back to those sources and doing some digging before you believe what it says is often the key.
I think, unfortunately, because there's so much misinformation on the internet and in social media, that so many people now legitimately feel that they can't trust what's on the internet. And I think, again, unfortunately, that has spread to distrust of the media, distrust of a lot of scientists and scientific, truths. And I mean, there's some legitimate reasons for that. At one point in time, cigarette smoking was considered healthy. You get all these feelings of uncertainty, and it leads people to question everything. And I think that's one reason why people are so skeptical in terms of climate change and global warming. And I can understand it, but if you look at the overall, you have to have a broader view, and as readers, you have to look at as many different sources as you can and come to your own conclusions. And I think if you do that with a reasonable attitude and mindset, you're going to come to a conclusion that maybe the vast majority of scientists on climate change, for example, aren't all stupid, and they aren't all wrong. And so I'm probably preaching to the choir here. I don't think there are probably a lot of climate deniers in this audience, but it's difficult, and social media can be a help. The internet can be a real help in terms of our job, but there's also danger there.
I mean, I would just add, I also manage, in addition to a lot of other things, I also manage E360 social media accounts, so I'm dealing with this on a daily basis. And I think, one of the easiest ways to make sure that you can trust what's coming from, a news source is to actually get your information from, federal agencies or, verify. For example, the New York City Department of Education is going to tweet something that is, an actual press release from them, and it's not going to be distorted in any way. So that's one, one way to do it. And if I come across a new news source, I never read anything until I've looked at their about page and their funders. I go straight from the article to that page to figure out whether or not I feel like I can trust that.
I don't trust it. I mean, Dorian is going to hit Alabama, is a perfect example, right? And I think that I love social media for being able to, let me know about something I might want to go read somewhere else. But as far as if somebody posts something and portrays it as fact, from my work with climate skeptics, I can just tell you there are a lot of trolls out there that are just intentionally putting misinformation out there online, and you have to be very, very, very judicious about what you actually believe that comes out of social media. Yeah.
Great. Good discussion there. Kat, earlier you alluded to the fact, or you actually said that, newsrooms, newspapers, they fire or they get rid of the environmental reporter when, budget times come and hard times are there. But I guess my question is, and this is maybe the $10,000 question, is how do you make this mainstream and how do you make environmental reporting really important and critical?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that the environment is its own individual beat, which is not true. Environmental issues are economic issues, they're political issues, they're health issues, they're land use issues. I mean, they touch on every single possible beat in news that you can imagine. And I think one of the biggest, the news industry has made a lot of mistakes covering this over the decades. The first was, okay, each outlet is going to have one environmental reporter, and that one person is going to be responsible for environmental news. And then I graduated from undergrad straight into the recession when nobody was hiring and journalisms were shuttering across the country. And as I mentioned before, that one environmental journalist was the first person out the door. And now we're sort of coming back to a point in the industry where people are starting to appreciate, the need to cover this issue again. But there, once again, here's the one environmental reporter, and that's going to be your job. And rather, it needs to be a newsroom-wide initiative. We're going to cover this across all of our subject areas. And think about when you're writing a weather story, when you're writing, a land use story or a zoning story, that has a green angle. What's going there? How is the building being built? What type of energy is it going to use? Is it on the waterfront? Is it going to be built in a sustainable, climate-resilient way? So I think that's been one of the biggest issue areas and one of the things that I think needs to change in order to make sure that this issue is actually fully covered to the extent that it needs to be.
I'll give you a quick example of exactly what Kat's talking about. I've covered over the past year and a half a lot of stories about Connecticut's forests and woodlands. And, we lost a lot of trees because of storms, because of invasive insects, because of a lot of these trees are 100 years old or 120 years old and they just die. But what I didn't realize until I got into the story is that how key trees can be for the urban environment. And in Hartford, for example, a couple of years ago, they had a budget crisis, and so they cut out their forestry budget. Well, it's a few $100,000 for a major city. It doesn't seem that important until you realize there are studies out there that show that if you put trees in a city neighborhood, crime goes down. The temperature of the city block will go down. People's property values will go up. And that's just from planting trees. And we're not talking about one study, we're talking about studies in Los Angeles, in Chicago, and New Haven, I believe there was one. So it's trees, it's forestry, it's the environment, it's city budgets, it's climate change because the cities are getting hotter, it's social issues because the places in cities that have the fewest trees tend to be the poorest minority areas. So that's what I think Kat is talking about. These issues cut across all kinds of lines. And even today, working for a daily newspaper and a news organization, it's very difficult sometimes to convince editors of these things that go, really? Those things, property values would go up? So yeah, it's tough. And it's not getting any easier these days, I don't think. Somewhat better than the recession, but still fighting against the tides here in a lot of ways.
I think that there's a special opportunity here as well, and like with CFPA, we think about this as a sort of form of nonprofit journalism. We're not on the 24-hour news cycle. It's a quarterly magazine. And so, go to other outlets to stay current on what's happening, today. But we're trying to really do stories that are about connecting people here in Connecticut to the land, to the waters, to our shorelines, through stories about, so the feature article in this issue is about controlled or prescribed burns in Connecticut. it just so happens to have come out at the same time that the Amazon is up in flames. And so the story kind of like looks at the role of fire in terms of it's becoming more destructive with climate change, but also the need to do prescribed fire to increase habitat, especially for certain migratory birds and so forth. So I think that as major outlets may be, trimming their environmental coverage in some ways, and especially I think it's hard if you're like a sole beat reporter to convince your editors of certain things. But I think there's other opportunities where other organizations, Nature Conservancy has a great magazine, Audubon has a great magazine. So some of these environmental organizations can put out environmental, do storytelling and kind of pick up a piece that might not be covered by some of the other outlets.
The other part of this is that young reporters who are covering towns are becoming more and more aware of these issues and more interested in these issues. And that's a sign of hope, because a lot of times young reporters want to cover the murders and the blood in the streets, and I think there are a lot of younger reporters who are coming around to the idea that these issues are just as important, if not more important.
Yeah, and I think I definitely agree with that. And I think that, what the past month in Fairfield has shown is that environmental issues become important to people when they're local issues and when they're personal issues and when they affect you on a personal basis. And I think, the key in environmental journalism right now is to be getting across the message to people that the environment is a deeply personal issue for every single person on planet Earth. And because it's once those issues are personal and they feel local that people start to care. And so I think that's the task of journalists right now in the environment, is to make those things personal.
Great, thank you. And one more question, and then we'll open up questions to the audience. Greg, I think it's your turn to start. Always happens. What are the biggest challenges in 2019 of being an environmental reporter?
Part of it are the other distractions. The climate issues and the environmental issues are so big and so broad and so about everything that it's sometimes difficult, at least for a daily news reporter like I am, to get my editors and get the paper focused on these particular kinds of issues. Sometimes it's obvious when a giant storm hits, and people say, well, we didn't used to have these many storms like this. They weren't as intense. You can explain to them that, okay, the climate change models are predicting this. This is what we're going to have to deal with. So that's a big problem. If the politicians aren't talking about the environment in a presidential campaign or a U.S. Senate campaign, and the reporters who are covering that aren't asking them those environmental questions over and over and over, it doesn't get part of the political discussion. So it's a difficult thing to get the news organizations, the politicians, and the people focused on these things, obviously. Otherwise, we would have done something about all this a decade ago or 40 years ago.
I think, I think one of the biggest challenges right now is that, at least for us at E360, and I think for a lot of outlets, is that there are so many doom and gloom stories. The world is on fire and the ice caps are melting and sea levels are rising and cities are flooding, and I could go on and on and on and on. But there's also a lot of really innovative work that's being done. And I think one of the biggest challenges is that, often those doom and gloom stories are, in one sense, they're the sexy stories, right? Everybody wants to read, that's the end of the world. And yet it's so important to try to find a way to tell those solutions-based stories and sort of give people a ray of hope. I don't know how many people read The New Yorker or read Jonathan Franzen, but he wrote an op-ed this week in The New Yorker basically saying the world is ending, like, just don't do anything, just give up, basically. And it's just not the message that, we need to be given. And so I think that's one of the biggest challenges. And then I'll just add one more thing. I think the other really big challenge is that while there's a lot of really great environmental journalism that's happening at daily newspapers now, a lot of the environmental reporting is now being done by nonprofit news organizations, organizations that formed, 10 years ago, when newspapers were cutting their staff, and there was this sort of understanding that if we want there to be anything, we're going to create these, beat-focused publications. Most of them, if not all of them, are online, and they're all foundation funded and funded by readers. But nobody wants to pay for their news now. And that's a constant challenge. And I think if you go to any environmental news outlet, environmental focused news outlet, nonprofit news outlet across the country, environment or not, they're going to say the same thing. There are so many stories that we could tell if only we had the budget to do it. But it's the challenge. People have gotten so used to being able to access all this news for free. I grew up getting my local town newspaper delivered to my doorstep, and even I sort of balk now. You want me to pay? What? So I think that's, another constant challenge that is happening to a lot of nonprofit news sites that have stepped, into this field.
Definitely. I wondered if the Franzen piece is going to come up tonight.
Oh, yes.
So I agree with what's been said, and to the issue about hopefulness. One of the things I really enjoy about not having to deal with the 24-hour news cycle is that we can do at Woodlands stories that are a little more hopeful, and also stories that are really connecting people with what's in your own backyards. One of the things that really concerns me about, and I think that young people in general are much more environmentally engaged these days, but they don't necessarily have a good background in natural history. And they're spending more and more time in front of screens and less time outside. And so one of the things that we try to do in the magazine specifically is to encourage people to get out and explore our trails. I mean, CFPA, we manage 825 miles of Blue Blaze trails in the state, and that's just Blue Blaze trails, in addition to coverage around forests and parks and so forth, urban and rural. And I've been just actually delighted, the people that I've met across the state who are passionate birders, who are passionate ornithologists, and just involved in a number of different ways with being outside. And that's a message that I try to always give. It's like, okay, read the stuff, understand the science. Climate change is a very, very serious threat, but also it's a beautiful world. Get outside, go swimming, go for a hike, things like that. Really connect to the earth. And the other thing that I always want to say regarding money is that there's not much money in this field in general. And so, climate change is probably the most important issue of our time. But I'm also really concerned with all the other stuff that this current administration is doing. Yeah. And so it's where do we put the money and the attention, when there's so many fires out there. So it's tough. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd also highlight what's been said about just the information overload we're given these days and the 24-hour news cycle. And as someone who works in that, it's really hard even for me to be able to focus on covering one thing at a time. And then I can't even imagine being a reader trying to figure out what we're supposed to read today. There's so many things out there. And I think it's just that's the big challenge, is focusing the mind. And I think also, like the young people these days, myself included, just have no attention span. And I think my generation just does not know how to focus on one thing at a time. And it's really hard to really grab that focus and get someone interested in a long, deep issue that they have to deeply think about. And I think that's a lot of the challenge right now, is getting people not to just read a couple hundred words at what you have to say and get the main idea, or listen to, a 10-minute podcast about it, but to really sit down with an issue and have a cup of tea over it and understand it. And I think that's the big challenge we're facing with that.
Great. So I'm going to open up the questions to the audience. I have a microphone here, so we'll pass that around. Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask the panel?
Thank you. Wonderful listening to all of you. Gives me hope. I think we'd all agree that climate change is the biggest, or certainly one of the biggest environmental stories of the time. But the other side of that, of course, is that we have an administration that doesn't quite feel that way in Washington. And there is headlines each week of this rollback and that rollback of EPA regulations. Today was on water. I'm sure you saw that. How will people like you be covering that? How do we cover the consequence of the rollback and the step away from environmentalism that had been moving forward and now has the brakes been put on it in Washington?
I think one of the things that is happening, at least from my perspective, my job, is that when the federal government steps back on issues like this, states become more important. Local governments become more important. I'm not sure that it's translated completely. I'm not sure the politicians in Hartford or the politicians in Fairfield understand that they're now on the front lines. But they are, because every rollback that happens in Washington means that if you want to protect the environment, if you want to do more for the environment, it's going to have to happen at the state level, it's going to have to happen at the local level.
I mean, there's a million ways to cover this issue, and we've tried to cover as many of them as we can at E360. But I think, one of the things, just like Greg said, that a lot of states are stepping up and at least taking preliminary steps to fill that gap. And even if they aren't labeled as climate change initiatives or other environmental initiatives, down south you have a lot of policies that deal with nuisance flooding. They're not called sea level rise flooding, they just label it as nuisance flooding, and it's how they get away with doing these policies without causing a major controversy and political debate. And so you're starting to see, local politicians find ways to do this work. I will say, we're a national, international publication based in New Haven. It's often hard for us to find those hyper-localized stories, but we have a network of freelance writers that we work with all across the U.S. and all across the world that are bringing those stories to us. And then I think the other thing we have to worry about with the federal rollback of these regulations is just our international reputation. That's huge, but that reputation has been quite tarnished in the last, 3 years anyway, and so it's just like another facet of this whole issue that China has emerged as the key leader, global international leader on climate change, and that's a role that we filled for a long time. So.
Yeah, and I somewhat do blame the media because it seems like the media just gets obsessed with Trump's tweets, and he's really good at sort of obfuscating the issues. If there's a major rollback of some regulation happening, he comes out with a really controversial tweet, and everybody's covering that and not covering what's actually happening in this country. And so I do think that the media needs to be vigilant and to not lose track of what are the real stories out there, and then to put them into a human level, right? So what do these rollbacks mean for public health? What do they mean for groundwater contamination or things like that? On your personal level. Because if it just becomes about regulation or deregulation, it's easy to argue back and forth on that and forget about the human impacts in the local level.
Yeah, I think that local level is also, as has been said, so key right now. As someone who covers local news like everyone else here, I think when things hit the fan federally, the state and local news becomes that much more important, and getting people to be tuning into what's happening at your local level is going to be, I think, the way forward for a lot of these things.
I think there's another question from Kathy.
Hi, I was talking to Kathy earlier, and she was mentioning Facebook. You manage the social media for your paper, and they classify, Facebook has their own rules and regulations, and they classify any environmental coverage as inherently political. And is that a explain a little more about that. Is that a restriction? And do other social media do that? And if we want to promote your article, should we be on Twitter and Facebook? Or if you just sort of expand on that a little bit.
Sure. So, yeah, we were talking at the back of the room before we got started. So, in response to the election and sort of the how a lot of organizations can use Facebook and appear like they're a news organization, but they're not actually a news organization. Facebook has tried to crack down by putting in a series of safeguards. You have to go through a verification process, which is a very extensive, I mean, you know, having to send a picture of your license and getting a piece of mail to your home address and, you know, sending tax documents, and I mean, it's to get verified as a news organization, and then they have to vet you and all of that, and then they have a whole list of you know, the verified news organizations, which is, you know, their sort of preliminary step to help readers navigate that social media sort of information, but you know, in terms of what has happened is, because we have an international audience, we will often pay, you know, $10, $20 to be able to, it essentially creates an ad of our posts to make sure that people that are in a particular area or interested in a particular subject are, you know, will see our articles pop up in their newsfeed. People, you know, potential readers that we might not otherwise be able to reach. And in this whole, you know, all these new regulations, Facebook has classified that anything that is a social justice or political issue needs to be labeled as a political ad. Basically, if you see a Facebook post and at the top it says, you know, sponsored by, and then it will have the organization name. And when they made all of these changes, that they designated that any environmental or science issue was inherently a political issue, which has caused, you know, a bunch of controversy and debate. And the rules are very loose, because if it first hit us, they first got instituted, and we published a story about companies getting really creative about reusing their waste heat. You know, like not a political issue, and it got flagged. Our ad got rejected because they determined it was political, and we weren't approved to post it yet. So anyway, it's the whole social media sphere is complicated, and news organizations are trying to figure out how best to use it, and Facebook is trying to crack down in ways that they think are best, but maybe aren't. It's a very tumultuous time.
How do we know that something is, I'm not very good with Facebook. How do we know that something is a vetted out news organization such as yours, or just, like Alexis was saying, a blog? How do we know as somebody who just uses Facebook?
So if you go to the organization's Facebook page, their sort of, you know, their homepage on Facebook, in their About section, it'll say, you know, this is a verified news organization. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the audience?
This one over here.
I'm going to ask Kathy, do you mind bringing the microphone over? Thank you. There.
This question is mostly for Greg, but maybe for the rest of you. Have any of you either themselves or know of other people who have had stories squashed because of either corporate influence or political influence?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. I'm trying to think of whether there have been any environmental related stories that's happened to, and I can't think of any at the Hartford Courant right now. There have been stories that, in my opinion, were, you know, probably looked upon as not favorable to whatever industry or organization or that we pulled back on, which I didn't agree with. But on the environmental side, no, what happens generally is that the stories will get buried, that they will not be at the top of the web page. They won't be on the front page or the second front page of the print edition. That's a bigger story. Or there's not enough, as Kat was saying earlier, you don't have to be overtly against investigative journalism of any type. All you have to do is not give reporters enough time, or cut the number of reporters available to do that. It's investigative journalism is labor intensive, and it takes, generally good stuff takes time to do. And so as the news organizations have shrunk, as their budgets have been cut, as their ad revenue goes down because nobody wants to pay for news anymore, and I'll bet that a higher percentage of you folks still get newspapers. Most young people don't. They don't do newspapers. And without those, organizations like mine have a very tough time getting funding. So I think the bigger issue for environmental stories is that I haven't seen any pushback generally in terms of my editors on these stories. I just think that they're not paying enough attention, or they're not giving them enough play. One example was this huge chemical PFAS spill that went from Bradley Airport back in the beginning of June. It flooded through the sewers, maybe 20, 30,000 gallons of this stuff, and into the Farmington River, which had a few months earlier been declared a national wild and scenic river because it had been cleaned up so much. We wrote stories at the start that this had happened and that there were tests, but I kept writing stories because I knew it was a bigger issue than that. And I couldn't get it at the top of the webpage. I couldn't get it on the page one of the newspaper until the governor finally called a news conference and said, we need to have a state task force, we need a state action plan. And then finally it got to the top of the news budget and the top of the newspaper page. So unfortunately, I think it might be easier to fight if we just had pushback from special interests on environmental stories. I think the big problem is there's not enough money, there's not enough reporters, there's not enough space, there's not enough time.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh. Sorry, we only have one mic, so.
It's okay.
You want to go first?
No, I'm one of the hosts. You go.
Some of us can remember back to the Exxon Valdez and the burning of the Cuyahoga River in Ohio, and those are moments that are sometimes pointed to as the beginning of the environmental movement. Certainly, the Exxon Valdez catalyzed or accelerated the invention of EPA during the Nixon administration, I believe. Is it possible there could be moments like that that could change things dramatically for us in this room, on your side of the table and elsewhere?
Unfortunately, I think it's going to take disasters. We tend not to focus very well as human beings unless there's danger involved. So I think maybe what's happening right now is going to be the catalyst, whether it's hurricanes that are wiping out islands in the Caribbean or flooding New York City or Miami. Miami's going to go underwater. And when it finally starts to hit again and again and again, I think you're going to see politicians respond because they'll have to. Although they haven't so far on gun control, so I don't know.
I mean, I think there are a lot of those really drastic examples of how our world is changing, but unfortunately, I mean, you just look at what's happening in the Arctic, for example, what's happening in Alaska. Permafrost is melting, cities are crumbling into sinkholes, roads are being warped, sea ice is disappearing, but the problem is that those are in remote areas. And I agree with Greg that I think that those moments that are starting to capture people's attention are the disasters that are happening right here in the continental U.S. And you know, Maria, Dorian, Sandy, I wrote a whole book about Sandy, and how that changed, you know, especially in the Northeast, completely changed policymakers' perceptions on their risk to climate change. And I think the other big thing has started to shift in recent years is attribution science. For a really long time, scientists were very cautious about saying, you know, that a particular weather event was caused by climate change or made worse by climate change, and that is starting to change because the tools, it's getting faster to make those connections, and you're seeing scientists much more openly say, you know, Dorian was strengthened because of, you know, X. And as those connections become stronger and as the scientific community becomes more vocal about those connections, I think that will hopefully also help to catalyze some action.
I mean, there are things that I don't think the average citizen, maybe most reporters, don't really get the connection between climate change and things that are happening. We're having more invasive insects. We're having more mosquitoes with potentially deadly or dangerous diseases in Connecticut. And the reason is that our winters are warmer, that these insects are not being killed off. They're spreading north. And, you know, I just wrote a story about schools in southeastern Connecticut where the number of mosquitoes with Eastern equine encephalitis has risen dramatically over the past month or so. And so these schools are now restricting when they're playing football games, when they're playing soccer games or track meets, so to keep kids out of the danger zone, which is an hour before sunset. So these things, and that's part of climate change.
I think you actually raise a really interesting question because, you know, as Kat alluded to earlier, I mean, there's catastrophic things that are happening right now, and they're not necessarily happening to people in this room. And I think that until things start to hit home a little bit more, that it's hard for me to foresee that there's going to be, you know, much widespread response to major threats. And it's not just climate change, you know, biodiversity loss is at its highest rate since humans have existed, or its fastest rate since humans have existed. You know, plastic is a major, plastic pollution is a major issue, especially in our oceans. So there's like all these things that are happening right now. And as a father of a young kid, I'm like really concerned of like, how bad is it going to get before we have a serious response, you know? And I look to young people a lot. I mean, I think that you'll see later on this month some of the strikes that are happening around the UN Climate Week and youth leaders that are, I mean, the Friday strikes, you know, of like walking out of school on Fridays in protest to grown-ups, adults, not taking on climate and making that more of a serious issue. So I would like to say I'm hopeful that people will start to deal with issues, and you know, but again, there's so many issues to deal with, and I know for myself, you know, at the end of the night, you're kind of tapped out. You got work, you got, you know, make dinner, and you got the kid to bed and everything like that, and then you don't necessarily want to think about like these really heavy issues. You just want to watch, you know, a game, or you want to watch, you know, and just kind of veg out for a minute, and it's sort of like I think until those impacts start to be felt like on a personal level, on a local level, like things that you're covering here in Fairfield.
I just want to make one other point, which is that with all these gloom and doom that we've been talking about, we should remember that our air is a lot cleaner than it used to be. Our water is a lot cleaner than it used to be. There are a lot more people today really interested in the environment than there used to be. I mean, tree hugger used to be a joke, right? And the fact that you're sitting here is an indication that you guys care. I wish there were more young people out there. I wish there were more black people and Hispanic people in this room. If I've missed somebody, I apologize. Because the things have changed for the better. I mean, we have osprey and eagles in the state of Connecticut, and we'd almost killed them off. So just as we're talking about all this, things have gotten better. We can make things better. Clearly, we've done it.
I think there's a question. Oh.
There's a couple of questions.
So this alludes exactly to what you were just saying, Greg. Specifically, I want to know how you all have handled balancing the pessimist, optimist, and then also the realist side of communicating environmental issues, because you don't want to shut your audience down with the doom and gloom, like you were saying, but at the same time, you don't want to make everybody feel like, oh, it's fine, someone's taking care of it. You know, there's more ospreys.
Part of the thing about being a daily news reporter is that our first job is to warn people when things are bad, when things are wrong. If there's a fire down the street, you want to know. But we also are trying really hard to find that other side of the story to balance it out. There's a guy named Bren Smith who's pioneered some great, what he calls vertical ocean farms along the shoreline in Brantford and several places up and down the shoreline. And the idea is to grow kelp and shellfish in these farm systems. And the kelp will clean the water. And then you can use it we can eat kelp. You can use it for fertilizer. You can feed it to cows to reduce the methane that they burp. So, I mean, we've written stories. I think you guys had stories on him too. Yep. We tried to get that mix. I'm sure it's difficult, especially when you have the Amazon forest burning and all this other stuff that we've talked about tonight. You just have to keep working at it and not to give up hope.
I think, it's a constant balance, and in our small newsroom, it is a weekly conversation when we're looking at our editorial calendar and all the stories that we have coming up or that we've just assigned, and realizing, okay, these are all negative, these are all, disaster, climate impacts, we need to change that, and actively going out and finding those stories so that we have a good mix of both. And I will say too, like from a personal toll, I'm editing now and not doing as much reporting, but when I was working as a reporter for Inside Climate News, it can really get to you as a personally on a personal level. You get to the end of every day and you're like, oh my gosh, can I write a positive story? So there's also that, for me, when I was a reporter, also that I needed to have a little bit of hope and feeling that maybe my readers felt the same way.
I think it's also really important to be able to give a reader a direction of how they can get involved. And that's somewhat of like a hopeful task, So it's not just like, oh, here's this really awful thing, but it's like, here's this really awful thing, and here's what some people are doing to address it, And so as a reader, you see that, and you're like, oh, they're doing this, I can get involved. I can get involved with my local organizations. I can go to city council meetings, things like that. I can, I can change how I garden or how I treat my lawn and my own property, things like that. So like small things, so you're not just like walking away from a story and thinking like, oh my God, it's just really awful, but you're walking away thinking like, okay, this needs some attention, and this is a way that people are addressing it, and this is a way I could get involved and help make a positive difference.
Yeah, I
Larry?
agree
Oh,
that.
sorry.
Sorry, that call to action is so important. Like in terms of creating active versus passive readers. Getting readers active through a story is really important.
Larry, did you have a question?
Yes, this fits in with what you're talking about, but if when there is an article, whatever it is, if you could squeeze in something educational about the benefits of the assets that the environment provides, for example, swamps and storm mitigation. Can that be done? It doesn't have to be open all the time. It could be kind of subterfuge. But
I think we do try to do that. I mean, I was talking earlier about urban forestry, and one of the main points of the story that I was trying to make was the benefits of planting more trees. And I got activists who were planting trees, and people in Hartford and New Haven and Bridgeport who were actively trying to improve the, as they call it, the urban canopy. I love that term. So we try to. I think we try to do that. Sometimes it just gets overwhelmed by the bad news, but that's also part of what readers do when they read. If there's a big story and it talks about a bunch of bad things and some good things, I think people are gonna, if they're reading the story to be warned about an issue or about a disaster or whatever, they're gonna focus on that, and they're gonna forget about the other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that's really at the heart of what we do at E360 is we're not going to tell somebody about a disaster or something bad that's happening without putting it into context and making the stakes very clear to our readers. And that's both for, negative things that are happening, but also positive things that are happening. We ran a story earlier this week where a reporter of ours went down to Colombia to look at how dozens of major cities across Latin America are starting to adopt electric buses and make them a key part of their transit. And it was, yes, a huge part of it is about meeting their climate targets, their Paris climate goals, but it's also going to have a huge impact on air quality. It's going to drastically cut fuel costs, and that the benefit of that on these already strapped urban budgets when these cities are growing like mad. And so that's really at the heart of what we do at E360, constantly putting everything into context and putting everything, making the stakes very clear.
Mary?
Sorry. I wanted to get back sort of to the Facebook question about it being political, because I read about Francis Rooney in Florida, who's a Republican, and saying, come on, guys, we need to face facts that their climate change is real and we're not supporting our constituents properly. It doesn't make sense to me that this is a political issue. Is there reality in thinking that Francis Rooney is one of the beginning of something happening within the Republicans, or?
I mean, honestly, if you were to talk to most Republican lawmakers behind closed doors, they would agree that climate change is an issue. You ask them in public, it's a very different answer. I think that we're starting to see some shifts in that, but it's very early stages. But at the same time, I feel I used to cover climate politics, so I used to cover this a lot. And I feel like I've been writing about that for 10 years, that change could potentially be happening. I think one of the big recent changes has been industry's acceptance of climate change and the need to take action. I mean, you see this from, CEOs co-writing letters about the need for climate action. You see this when the Trump administration tries to roll back methane regulations, and oil and gas companies go, whoa, actually, we don't want you to roll back these regulations. when they try to, get rid of Obama-era fuel efficiency standards, and automakers go behind and make a deal with California because they say all these other countries are doing this internationally. We can't just go backwards. And so I think what has changed in the last couple years has been the pressure from the private sector. And for so long, that was what was holding a lot of Republicans back because those were their funders. And so, I'm probably being too optimistic here, and I've probably been too optimistic on this subject for a long time, but maybe I'm going to keep lying to myself that this is, the change is happening.
Unfortunately, I think we need to see the polls pressure the politicians. As more and more Americans recognize how important climate change is and it's really happening, and we have to do something about it, these politicians are going to reflect that. It may take some more time because this is a very slow process, and a lot of people, it may be, sad to say, it may be a generational thing. I think an awful lot of younger people have no question in their minds that climate change is happening, that we should do something about it, because they're looking at the rest of their lives having to deal with this. I think that as time goes by, you're going to see the polls more and more, and unfortunately, as the hurricanes hit and the tornadoes and the invasive insects and this, that, and the other thing, it's going to convince more and more people. And if the polls show that many people believe in it and want something done, then you're going to see political action.
And I did, just really quickly, I did see a poll that I think it came out a couple weeks ago that broke down climate beliefs within the Republican Party by generation. And if you're looking at young Republicans, the number was something like 2/3 of young Republicans accept that climate change is happening and understand that it's an issue that action needs to be taken on. So, unfortunately, we don't have that kind of time. And so, and I think the other issue is that it's one thing to say that you care about climate change and you're concerned about it, and it's a different issue to vote on the issue of climate change. And right now, climate change, I think, is still, it's not even in the top 10 of all ages voting priorities.
Yeah, that's something I was going to say. I mean, I don't think it's just Republicans. I think if Jay Inslee hadn't been a candidate in this current, race, that climate change amongst Democratic candidates for president wouldn't have been as much of an issue for Democratic candidates as well. And Jay Inslee kept coming back and saying, this is the issue I'm running on, this is the most important issue of our time, we have to really prioritize that. And politically, you saw the other candidates come out with their own climate or energy policies or plans. And so I would hold Democrats to count too. But to also the point about generations, so there's an interesting organization called the American Conservation Coalition. And these are young people. I think that the president and founder is 20. But it's a conservative, right-wing leaning student organization that's really concerned about climate change. And what they're doing is they're going to D.C. and they're meeting with Republican elected officials in the legislature, in the Congress, and saying, look, we are the next generation of voters. This is something that's really important to us. If you are not on board with dealing with climate change, we're going to support, they're not going to go to Democrats, but they're going to support Republicans to challenge incumbent Republicans. And it's actually, I think, an interesting model that's starting to show some traction. They also then, when the elected officials go back to their home districts, these students, they have student chapters all over the country, and they're affiliated with student Republican organizations. But they'll actually go for hikes with elected officials and just getting outside and talking about the importance of a healthy, clean, safe environment for people in their generation. And I think that's really important. I was talking actually to the president of this organization. His name is Benji Becker, I think. And he said, the problem is you can't have somebody from the left go talk to somebody on the right and expect the person on the right is going to listen to them about climate change. It has to come from somebody who shares sort of their political ideology. And so that's the legitimacy that these students have in talking to Republicans, is that these are student Republicans, they're for free market ideology and policies. but they think that climate change is a very serious issue and they want the Congress to be addressing it. So.
I think money is also going to play a role here, is that when your pocketbook at the local level or state level or federal level is really starting to be hit by the effects of climate change, when you have to potentially relocate a whole sewage plant because it's going to be underwater in a few years, or build a giant wall around it to prevent the next hurricane from wiping it out. We're talking billions and billions of dollars, and when that starts to hit, that could force some change too.
I think we have time for one more question. Joy, did you have a question?
No, I don't know whether it really fits into, I just think of special, thank you, special problems, like people who just say, oh, I think that the divine power is going to take care of this and it'll be all taken. And that just defeats you right there. And I wonder, do you ever, in your journalistic efforts, just make a tiny reach for these closed-minded, the people who have mechanisms to close off their mind to reality?
I'll let you take
Who wants to touch that question?
I mean, it's the constant struggle. I mean, but as much as I would like to, and as much as I might have tried to do that in the past, I've had some very smart editors that have taken out that snarkiness, and
there are people that you can't reach. There are whole segments of the population that no matter how many facts you present, no matter how many informed opinions from scientists you show them, they're not going to believe it for whatever reason, whether it's political or religious or what. And you can't focus. I don't think you can focus on those people. They're a minority, thank goodness. Otherwise, we'd be worse off than we are now. So you have to write for the general public, not the totally closed-minded people.
I mean, and I will say, I think there has been, within the religious communities, movement from leaders. I mean, just, everything that the Pope has done and how he's made this a key part of what he talks about, even within the evangelical churches. Catherine Hayhoe is amazing, and I applaud the work that she's been doing to, she's, for those of you who might not recognize the name, she is a climate scientist who happens to be an evangelical, has made it a key part of her mission to educate the evangelical community on the issues of climate change. Her husband is, in fact, I think, an evangelical pastor. And so I think there is some movement, but I do think that, we as journalists, sometimes we are, especially environmental journalists, we're preaching to the choir. You are interested in environmental issues, and that's why you're reading the environmental stories. There are so many people who read a headline and go, no, I'm not interested in this. I'm going to go to the sports section or the politics section, or and it's the eternal question, especially for news organizations like ours that are so focused on environmental issues. I mean, that is something that we are constantly trying to reckon with, is how do we reach new readers that might not otherwise read us, and people who might simply be turned off by our name, Environment 360. So, yeah.
I don't think a lot of the people you're talking about actually read. I mean, I'm just not, They probably watch Fox News and, that's about it,
I think that's a great way to end our discussion.
There you go.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for listening to us jabber at
Yeah,
you.
no, thank you, Kat, Greg, Timothy, and Rachel. This is so insightful, so educational, and hopeful. We've learned a lot tonight, and thank you to the audience for coming. I know there's a lot of commitments, and I know, Mary has a commercial.
Be hopeful for.
Good.
I also have to say, so I
I'm co-president with this most amazing woman, and I just have to say thank you. But this is all Alexis. So she did this, she thought of it, so great job. And now for my commercial. So to be hopeful, come join us this Saturday. It's our Green Wheels Expo. It's during National Drive Electric Week. And it's important to get rid of the CO2 and all the greenhouse gases coming out of our transportation sector. It's a very big part of the problem. And we have, I think, 7 different types of cars that you can go for test drives. And we have a school bus from White Plains, an electric school bus, so you can come and take a look up here, like this. They're all doing this. Oh, there, sorry. How about like right in front of my face? And lots of other fun stuff. We've got lawnmowers, leaf blowers, motorcycles, Vespa scooters, all electric, right? So, and lots of activities for you to do. Our food truck, Mini Munch, is an EV truck. Cool. It's zero waste fare. Like, we're walking the walk. So come have fun, free, and rain or shine. Thanks.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Well, I'll be there. Thank you. Just as a parting gift to our friends here, we just want you to remember Fairfield. So we have a special gift bag for all of you.
Oh,
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Very kind of
All
you.
right, and please, there are plenty more refreshments, so please stay around, mingle with these guys for a few more minutes, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
These are environmental friendly.
I hope so.